Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle FP&A Leadership Forum. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which includes complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Rena Kacker, FP&A Executive, SaaS, FinTech, and Life Sciences. We're excited to have Rena with us for her keynote titled Future of FP&A, Strategizing for Success and Strengthening Forecast Accuracy. Welcome, Rena, and over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Rena Kacker. I'm in the Bay Area, and I'm currently in the space of FP&A. This happens to be my third career. I started out as a computer science engineer way back in a past life, moved on to FinTech and did about a decade in FinTech. And most recently, I've been in the life sciences space, primarily focused in the FP&A function. I'm pleased to be here, and I'm excited to share these 30 minutes with you. So at a high level, what is FP&A? And I know a lot of our audience are well versed with this, but I would just like to set the stage up for everyone. So FP&A is a multifaceted function. It basically interacts extensively within the company, but also has external stakeholders. I consider FP&A to be comprised of 5 key areas. One that most people identify with right off the bat is budgeting and forecasting. This is where we build out an annual operating plan. We figure out what our earnings guidance is going to be for public companies, and then we try and execute to that plan. And then over the course of the year, we recalibrate in monthly or quarterly forecasts and do budget versus actuals, and that's something that most of you are well versed with. The other part is financial reporting. This is where FP&A provides data-based insights to the management and to the company, provides good analytics on revenue and how the customer acquisition, customer activity is going, and things of that nature. So they are thought leaders for a variety of areas in the organization. The third area which is very much the core of FP&A, is business partnering. This is when you want to get a new consultant to engage or any other new expense to pursue. You reach out to your finance partner and you say, hey, I want to make this happen. How do I do it? It is either in your budget or not. And your business partner, finance business partner, partners with you to make that happen. And they recommend trade-offs, and they are here to enable you succeed. And they have ways to fit everything in so that the financial picture stays solid while you get your needs met. The fourth and very important area is long-range planning. This is the strategic 3 to 5 year plan, where we look out at what is the company going to look like, where will we focus our investments, and what do we hope to become in a long-term plan. And this is basically important when we go raising cash or meeting potential companies that might be buyers or other exit strategy. Long-range plan is key to this, and it tends to be basically a bottoms-up plan to say, what do we invest to grow and to seek out a better valuation. And finally, expense management. This is more of a tactical responsibility of FP&A, where any expense that gets initiated has to go through the FP&A funnel to ensure that the contractual terms, whether it's payment terms or obligations, are reasonable, and that it is in the forecast, or it is basically worded correctly and doesn't expose the company to any financial risks. So those are the 5 key areas of FP&A. The next slide. So With my experience having focused on fintech, life sciences, and SaaS, I wanted to basically compare and contrast how these areas differ for the top line and bottom line forecasting. So forecasting is such a generic term. It's happening in many different facets of our lives, but specifically focusing on these three areas. Yeah, that one. When it's SaaS, SaaS is software as a service, and you have many other things as a service these days. In SaaS, the revenue forecast is pretty smooth because it's ratable, and you get a contract, the revenue just keeps coming in over the course of the contract. The key in SaaS is customer acquisition and how many customers can you get on board. That is called like your new ARR, annual recurring revenue. And then how much upsell you can do, which is adding subscriptions to existing customers. And then the most important part is renewal, because for most companies, a vast majority of their revenue is coming from existing customers, and they need to renew their contracts every year, every couple of years. So they spend a ton of time making sure that the renewals keep coming and we don't lose customers along the way. So those are the things that build up the revenue funnel for SaaS. In fintech, it's very similar to SaaS. You have customer acquisition, but then you also have to consider customer activation and activity, because fintech companies, such as the payment companies and others, they get their revenue is determined by how often the customers transact and how much they transact. So it's one thing to have 5 million customers, but it's another thing to see how many are actually paying customers, how many are actually interacting and highly engaged. So that drives the revenue in fintech. And in life sciences is a very different space. You have an addressable market for a therapy or a medication or a medical device, but then you have to consider what number are you into the market? Are you the first in the market? Are you second? Is there already a standard of care in the market so that you are just another player in the market? And all of those sort of represent your share of the total market. And then based on the pricing of the therapy, which varies widely between geographies and different spaces, you can then calculate your potential revenue out there. And obviously life science companies, there is a whole process until they can get to commercial. So a lot of investment goes in before they start turning revenue. So that was a little bit about the top line. For the bottom line, there are a lot of similarities between the three business lines. Basically, it's R&D across the board. You need to have your product development folks, your technical scientists in life sciences, your financial engineers in fintech. So there's the headcount costs. In SaaS and in fintech, you have a variety of hosting costs because you are dealing with large amounts of data. And then you're also dealing with capital costs, whether it's, these days we don't have that many servers, but yeah, if it's servers or machines or big equipment in case of life sciences, so that's capital costs. And beyond all of that, there is basically your general and administrative. You have legal, finance, investor relations, human resources, facilities, IT are the other departments. So those costs are basically pretty standard, and those should be, there should be leverage. So as the company grows, the G&A should not have to grow as quickly as the rest of the company. So that's a little bit about the top line and the bottom line forecast for the three different sectors. Next slide. So I'll let you consume that. So that's basically a little joke about how people like to react to the forecasts. It's not something that people really look forward to doing because it's a time-consuming process and there are implications to missing your forecast. So in many cases, you do see different parts of the organization putting slightly different pressures on the forecast. And on the next slide. Yeah, so here's a little picture of how different parts of the organization perceive the forecast. So finance, along with the C-suite, for the revenue targets, we have to try and strive to stick with the long-range plan to deliver those committed outcomes. And so we ideally want the top line to be super strong, and we pressure our departments to deliver those. Obviously, the people who are on the hook for bringing in those sales, they would probably want to be more conservative, and they would apply downward pressures on the forecast. And they will have, these are the enriching collaborating discussions that we will have with those teams to say, what is it that we need to believe to achieve a certain revenue, and kind of address their points of view and influence them to sign up for a higher target. So that is on the revenue side. On the headcount and expense side, basically every department, when you do your first roll up of a forecast, every department wants the moon and the stars. For every new thing that's in the initiatives for the current forecasting period, departments tend to ask for additional headcount, additional customer support, additional consulting spend, and it's finance then trying to bring that down and say, hey, you already have a team of X. Why would you need all of these incremental people to do these new initiatives? Why can't we leverage our existing folks better? And so those are the collaborative conversations that finance undertakes with the departments, because headcount is a very large expense item, and it's also very resource intensive. It's extremely intensive to onboard people, and the recruiting cycles are long, and with the tight labor market we are in, it's we have to be very thoughtful about how much headcount we truly need to pursue our initiatives and to meet our long range plans. So next slide. So this is something that over the course of my career, I have seen happen in many, many places, which is when we are looking out in the future, which is the green line, we basically strive for really exponential growth, and the longer out the time, the farther out the time frame, the higher we project our top line, everything is going to fall in place, and we're going to have really good results. As we come closer to those long range dates and plans, we realize, oh, we need a lot more resources, and we are not quite there yet. And these forecasts of revenue keep revising downward. And so the dark blue line is this year's view of the next 4 years. The middle line is last year's view of the next 4 years. And the top line is 2 years ago view of the next 4 years. And as you can see, it starts to keep shrinking down. That's on the revenue side. And this is just a pictographic depiction. But same thing happens on actually headcount and expense side, although not in the long range. In the shorter range, we might start the year out saying, oh, we're going to have 20% growth in headcount. And, based on that, all the other parts of the organization resource for that, whether it's recruiting or facilities, and everyone sort of gears up for that. And then we find that, oh, not only was the hiring cycle long, but we also had some attrition. And therefore, we are not quite going to grow as much as we thought. And in the meantime, we had laid out facilities dollars, recruiting resources, and we find ourselves not really meeting those headcount growth goals. So that is why we have to be optimizing for better forecast accuracy, because that helps the entire company meet its overall financial goal by not having wasted resources and wasted expense dollars. So next slide. So here's basically a pictographic depiction of what an accurate forecast delivers. So cross-functional alignment, like I said earlier, is essential to building a realistic and accurate forecast. We have to think, so even though beating the revenue targets is a good thing, if we are beating the revenue targets by a large amount, then perhaps our forecast wasn't quite on point. If our forecast had been correct all along, we would have then planned to find better use of investing that cash in other parts of the organization, whether it's R&D or a new initiative we could have initiated, and use those dollars to a better outcome. So I consider landing as close to the middle, as close to the pin as possible for revenue, headcount, expenses is the best outcome for the company, because even if we end up with a higher revenue, like I mentioned, that leads to suboptimal cash utilization. Similarly, if we end up with lower expenses, and that happens all the time, we don't spend what we thought we were going to spend. We don't hire the people what we thought we were going to hire. That basically also results in suboptimal use of cash. And especially in smaller companies, we live and breathe our lives in finance and all through the organization on the cash. You know, our fundraising and everything else is calibrated to our forecast. So it's very important that we don't swing either side too much, so that we have a predictable path to our bottom line results. So with that, I wanted to just mention that how do we do all of this? And you know, smaller companies might start out with Excel, but there are a lot of world-class tools that are available. I mentioned a few in the picture below that allow us to not only automate some of these, but also to enable the entire organization to share and have transparent access to the forecasts. So using these tools, you don't have to go in and open large files from 3 years ago. You can go in the tool and see what was your budget for 2 years ago, what was your forecast for 5 years ago in the long range plan, and you can even track down what were the initiatives back then, and that way you can run comparisons on how you can sort of back test your forecast. How are you executing based on what we thought 3 to 5 years ago? And these tools also enable us to appreciate the nuts and bolts of our forecast, because in our organization, somebody might wonder that if we are onboarding one headcount, it's $100,000 a year, for example. Well, by the time you come up with a fully loaded cost and you fold in the allocated expenses for benefits and facilities, the $100,000 person might end up costing over $200,000 because of all the other costs that get added. And so in these tools, all of that can be automated. For example, I have personally used IBM and Adaptive, and I found them extremely useful. We can pretty much set all the rates of, you know, the Medicare and wages and employer taxes and merit increases, everything, and when we want them to pan out, and we can then build our long range plan with all of that automated behind the scenes. Another thing that's super important, especially in life sciences companies, is capital expenses. So by basically these tools allow us to enter in what we are going to buy, and automatically our ERP and these planning tools then spread that capital expense over the course of its useful life and calculate our depreciation, amortization, all of that pretty automatically. So they give you a full picture, because sometimes Excel has its limitations. Besides version control, Excel can be a little challenging in automating a lot of these calculations. So I wanted to say that about the tools. They are extremely value-adding in improving our forecast accuracy and our ease of socializing the forecast within the organization. Next slide. So I wanted to basically touch on a little more detail as to, if you had to take away a few things about how to improve your forecast accuracy, it's important to keep that top of the agenda of cross-functional conversations, that everyone is aligned on the big picture. What is it we are trying to achieve this year? Is everyone aligned on that? And then is everyone aligned on what each department needs to deliver that big picture? Whether they are aligned on how they will leverage each other, what are the deliverables from one department that will be needed by another department? What will marketing need to do to drive the sales forecast? What will R&D need to do to drive that regulatory exercise that's happening in the regulatory department? So all of this has to be closely aligned, and a lot of these are moving targets. So the teams have to constantly be in conversations, and that's why the forecast is a living document, and it's always evolving, and that's okay. That's okay. Enabling collaboration to build an achievable forecast is very, very key, and people have to come to the table with an open mind. And then we have to find ways to reward and penalize forecast accuracy across all levels of the organization. So this should not just be a finance to do. Across the company, people have their goals. And when something is coming up 20% above or 20% below their target, there have to be at least some consequences. By the way, there's a statistic. 21% of the company have forecast accuracy of 10% and under, which is considered reasonable. 5% is considered excellent. 10% is considered reasonably good. So more than 79% of the companies out there have not so great forecast accuracy. And then shared goal setting. Like I mentioned, everyone has to be at the table in those strategic planning sessions, understanding what will it take to deliver what they are aspiring to achieve. And finally, pacing with the long-term strategy. So what I mean by that is, a lot of times we get our long-range plan done, and 2 months later, we find that, oh, this is about to be obsolete because now we are trying to do something totally different or slightly different. I think as seasoned employees, we need to influence the teams to stick with a strategy for a reasonable amount of time and pace with it to allow it to take root and deliver results. And that is basically going to help improve productivity, create some sense of predictability in the organization, and help us deliver better outcomes. That is what I had. I'll be happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Reena, for such an excellent keynote. We did have quite a few questions come through. And as a reminder, audience members can still enter their questions as well. This one question asks, does your forecast modeling take into effect the uncertainty of recession and increased interest rates?
That is a great question. And there are areas on the forecast that are more vulnerable to this than others. So that I would like to bring up two things. Number one, with regards to the recession, what teams typically do is scenario planning. So they have a mid-case forecast, and then they build scenarios saying, what if we have a recession and our demand drops by X percentage? And then you basically, if you don't think that that outcome is likely, you set it aside and don't look at it. But if you see that that is coming to fruition, then you basically give more importance to the scenario and maybe even convert it to your mid-case forecast. When it comes to interest rates, one of the direct impacts of the interest rate is your cash balances. So if you're sitting on $5 billion of cash, your interest income is going to be significantly better. And that's one direct outcome. Obviously, if you are financed by debt, that will hugely impact that. And all your debt payments and interest that you will pay on your debt will balloon. So there are areas of the forecast that are impacted by these.
Excellent, thank you. This next question, can you give examples of rewards and penalties of missing forecast accuracy?
Sure. So from my experience, from my past fintech experience, basically our compensation was tied. One of the variable compensation line items was tied to meeting the forecast goal. And this was set well in advance that if the forecast is within X% of the target, then for that percentage of your variable compensation, you get 100%, or even better than 100%. And then if there is a slightly worse accuracy, you get a certain other percent. And then if it falls even below that, and this could be either way, you could do too much better or too much worse, then there will be a higher penalty, and you would only get a very much lower percentage of the bonus. So it was mathematically tied, not just for the finance team, for all the enabling teams and partners, because it's a shared goal.
Great, thank you, Reena. This next question asks, or can you share any best practices on how to increase cross-functional alignment within an organization, especially in one that's siloed?
Yes, I would say that in most companies, we have sort of business operations reviews or other meetings, but the executive committee comes together and most parts of the organization come together. We have to make sure that those reviews include finance on the agenda, and the FP&A person should use those to socialize what's coming up on the calendar. And they should kind of simplify, because finance should not be perceived as a very undesired exercise. So they should simplify and make it easy for everyone to collaborate on the forecast build that's coming up or the budget process that's coming up. And they should also try and socialize that it's not going to be that time consuming. They should make it such that the teams can do a very good job in a finite amount of time by leveraging those tools that I mentioned, and creating very clear direction and templates, so that everyone can meet frequently. And this has to be an ongoing conversation. And then secondly, the budget versus actuals meetings or forecast versus actuals meetings should at least be done once a quarter with each department, with basically reinforcing suggestions. It doesn't have to be what went wrong. It has to be, how do we make this better the next time?
Great, thank you. It looks like we have time for one last question. What is the best way to analyze, compare, and contrast the multitude of FP&A tools that are available?
I think it depends on where the organization is at. What is the business line? What is the size of the organization? There is a ton of research available online on the different tools. So I think you can start there. For example, if you're dealing with inventory and cost accounting, certain tools will be more suitable than others. If you are focused on SaaS, then that might lead you to a different set. I personally feel that watching a demo of the tool, doing those discovery sessions at a very high level with at least 2 of the companies that you shortlist, is a great first place to start.
Thank you so much, Reena, for such an insightful presentation. I also want to thank everyone who joined us for this fantastic keynote. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following the event.